This week's 1044 is brought to you by Chevron Delos 600 ADF Ultra Low Ash Diesel Engine Oil. It's time to kick some ash. Winter weather is just around the corner. Is your coolant up to the challenge? Hey everybody, and welcome to the 1044, a weekly webisode from the editors here at CCJ. I'm Jason Cannon, and my co-host on the other side is Matt Cole. Coolant's one of the most basic fluids on a truck, and then it serves two purposes: helping cool the engine and protecting internal components from freezing. It very well may be the most vital fluid. But really, how often do you think about coolant? Twice, right? A day or so before a hard freeze, or when your truck starts to overheat. Those bad habits often show up in downtime because about 40% of engine-related problems can be tied back to the coolant system.
Coolant, like engine oil or anything else, is susceptible to breakdown, leaving the entire system potentially exposed to freezing temperatures as cooler weather starts to settle in across the U.S. I don't think you'll find any fleet shop that's not keenly aware of the role coolant plays in uptime, but Lawrence Wong, product technical specialist for Chevron Lubricants, says coolant historically is one of the most neglected fluids from a maintenance standpoint, despite the fact that a quick wellness check is pretty simple.
As we change seasons here, and getting into fall and the winter, I'd say that the main thing would be to focus on regular preventative maintenance, or as I think most carriers refer to as PM. It's very important, though. I think PM should probably happen year round. And that being said, the one fluid that often gets neglected most during regular PMs is the coolant. Incorporating coolants into your PM program, I'd say there are two quick things you can do to check for. And one of them is the pH and the other is the freeze point. And if one or both of those parameters are off, then that may indicate something's wrong with the fluid, and you may want to have a sample pulled and tested at a lab just to make sure. But once those two checks are done, make sure your cooling system is topped off with the appropriate coolant. I'd say try not to mix your coolants, and definitely don't mix conventional with extended life. In fact, the best practice would be to use the coolant that your engine manufacturer or OEM recommends. So I think if folks spent 5-10 minutes in their PM programs to check the coolants, they could reduce a lot of potential failures and issues that could crop up. Make sure you include all your fluids, including coolant.
Fleets have a couple of options when it comes to selecting a coolant: extended life and conventional. Obviously, as part of routine maintenance and best practices, you want to lean on an OEM recommendation, but best practices can go out the window if a driver is 700 miles away from a terminal and needs to make an adjustment. In those cases, specifically in topping off, Lawrence says it's important to know what kind of coolant is already in the reservoir so you can avoid mixing it.
Conventional coolant uses inorganic inhibitors, so like silicons and like phosphates, whereas an extended life coolant uses organic acid inhibitors. And if you mix the two, a lot of times the silicon in the conventional coolants don't play very well with extended life coolants. You could get gelling. That gelling could turn into deposits and blockage within the cooling system. And once you get that, if the coolant doesn't flow through your cooling system, it's obviously not cooling things down, and you can risk overheating and things like that.
Winter weather in Florida doesn't look much like winter weather in Boston, so Lawrence suggests long-haul carriers tune their coolant for the coolest climates in which they travel. Getting to that ideal temperature protection level, though, is a little more of a science than simply just topping off. But before we hear from Lawrence on balancing coolant with water, let's hear from 1044 sponsor, Chevron Lubricants.
Did you know that 90% of the ash and soot trapped inside your DPF right now is caused by your engine oil? It's not like you can go without engine oil, so there's nothing you can do about it, right? Wrong. Chevron spent a decade developing a no-compromise formulation when it comes to minimizing ash output and maximizing engine protection. Delos 600 ADF with OmniMax technology is an ultra-low ash diesel engine oil that is specifically designed to combat DPF ash clogging by cutting sulfate ash by 60% and extending DPF service life by 2.5 times. Delos 600 ADF also enables extended drain intervals thanks to an advanced antioxidant technology that prevents oil breakdown even at the high temperatures found in modern diesel engines. And by slashing the number of regens, Delos 600 ADF with OmniMax technology comes with a 3% fuel efficiency increase throughout the DPF's lifetime. If you're keeping score at home, that's decreased downtime, extended maintenance intervals, and improved fuel economy. That's real money in your pocket and time saved. Before you had to choose between protecting your engine or your after-treatment system, but now you don't. Delos 600 ADF with OmniMax technology. It's time to kick some ash.
For most carriers, that potentially consistently run in cold climates, I think it's important to make sure that their coolant is mixed well, meaning that the coolant in their system is in a 50-50 ratio, because a 50-50 coolant should have pretty good freeze point protection down to about minus 35, minus 36 F. So, like you were saying, if you're going from 60 degrees to, sub-zero temperatures down to like minus 35, minus 36 F, you should be pretty well protected. Or if you're driving through Alaska somewhere where it may get, colder than minus 35, minus 36 F, then, maybe switching up the coolant ratio, maybe to like a 60-40, would get you freeze point protection down to like, pretty close, like minus 60 degrees F. So hopefully you'll never need that. Oftentimes, the needed adjustments are, relatively small, and topping off may help bring the freeze point back to its optimal freeze point temperature. But when the freeze point is, quite a bit off and requires attention, then making sure you're making the right adjustments is key. So, such as if your freeze point is way too low, then you want to top off with water to bring the freeze point back up to, minus 35 F. But if your freeze point is too high, you'll want to top off with coolant. But in either case, knowing what the existing freeze point is, whether it's too high or too low, and figuring out how much coolant to drain from your system before topping off is key. And I think if you need help figuring that out, there's definitely like adjustment charts out there that can help with that. Or if you call your coolant supplier, they can help you out with that as well.
Lawrence says any adjustments that need to be made to coolant are often pretty small, and they're usually solved with the top off. But balance is important here because imbalance affects the performance of both the water and the coolant.
I think if you have too much coolant and not enough water, water is a really good heat transfer fluid. So it's really efficient at moving the heat away from your engine and keeping it cool. So, if you don't have enough water in the system and too much coolant, then you potentially risk overheating. And, in the wintertime, that may not be as big of an issue. But if, when we get through winter and transition back to summer, that could become something to watch for.
To accurately test your coolant, you're going to need something a little more scientific than a ball float gauge that you can pick up at any truck stop for a couple of bucks or test strips. While that's obviously better than nothing, Lawrence said a refractometer is really the way to go for accuracy, and it's only going to set you back around $50.
The ball float / hydrometer, tester, gives you a very general idea of the condition of your coolant, but it's not the most accurate. I recommend the carriers that, go and get a coolant, / glycol refractometer to measure your freeze point. It's much more accurate, and it's, I'd say, probably just about as quick to use as a ball float tester. It'll cost a little bit more. You can probably find one on like Amazon for, $30 to $50, or, you can probably find some, up to $100, $150 for better quality ones from, places like Granger or like Cole Palmer. But you can also ask your coolant supplier if they have refractometers.
Sometimes you need a deeper dive than a refractometer can give you in order to get a better understanding of what's happening inside the cooling system. In those cases, Lawrence recommends at least an annual test of the coolant, which can help inform decisions around when it's time to flush and refill the system.
Beyond the regular PM that you do, checking for pH, checking for your freeze point, We recommend that fleets periodically, maybe once or twice a year, pull a sample of that coolant and have it checked out at a lab. And what that will tell you, in addition to pH and freeze point, will be the level of inhibitors that you have remaining in your cooling system. So essentially, it tells you, how much coolant additives you have left in the system. And if it's at a condemning point, or if it's too low, then at that point, the carrier will want to consider just draining the fluid and replacing it with fresh coolant that has an adequate amount of inhibitors and coolant additives in there. When you do your PMs and you check your pH and your freeze points, if either one of those are off, then definitely I would pull a sample and have it tested just to see and make sure that your additive levels are adequate. Because sometimes you may get a leak in the system and air may get in there, it could contribute to hot spots. It could contribute to glycol breakdown, and you'll never know it, unless you check. Most of the labs will look to check not only the obvious physical conditions of the coolant, like you would do in a PM, so pH, freeze point, water concentration, but they'll also look at, and again, this depends on the lab. They'll check on your inhibitor levels, so the organic acid inhibitors, to make sure that you have adequate levels that are still in the coolant, providing protection. And they'll check for metals content. And what that can tell you is, if you've got any corrosion going on or contamination, or not only contamination from within the system, but potentially, sometimes you'll get contamination from a third-party coolant, right? If you've got a fleet that's running around out there and they're in the middle of their route, and all of a sudden the coolant light comes on or something, and they check under the hood and realize, oh shoot, I got to top off, but they don't have any coolant with them. They may stop anywhere along the way and buy ABC coolant and just top off with it, and so that could become an issue as well.
That's it for this week's 1044. You can read more on ccjdigital.com, and as always, you can find the 1044 each week on CCJ's YouTube channel. And if you've got questions, comments, criticisms, or feedback, please hit us up at 1044trucking@gmail.com or give us a call at 404-491-1380. And until next week, everybody stay safe.